Okay, thank you all for joining. Gonna go over some differences between Prisma and our ActiveRecord. I probably will skip some details over Rails because I think we're all pretty familiar with it. But at the end, we're gonna deep dive some of the internals and how they differ. So it'll be interesting. Okay. Let me just change my window. Sorry, thank you. Sorry, Gamma does not want to change the slide. There we go. That's weird. Okay, we'll see. So this is a quick overview of what we're going to go over. So we're just going to get a little bit familiar with Prisma, as I assume many of us haven't used it before. We'll go over some differences in the features, the usage, a bit what's lacking from each other. And then, as I said, we'll go into some of the nitty-gritty details, which are quite interesting at the end. So for Prisma, which is mainly used in JavaScript compared to Rails, which is in Ruby, they differ in the way they create the models and migrations, which we'll go over. Other than that, the main difference is that we statically typed in Prisma because of TypeScript, whereas Ruby, you don't have any of that. So I would say Prisma is very friendly to work with because of the types you get. So we just go over creating a model and how it differs between both of those. So in Rails, you'll be creating the model itself and then generating a migration. So you use syntax like this, and then you'll run it, which will then make the changes to the database. It's quite different in Rails. Prisma. It's the opposite. So instead, you have a schema file, and then you make your changes here. So if you want to have a new attribute, you add it in here, and you can just state what data type it should be and other parameters. And then you will then create your migration file on a command. So in other words, Rails is migration and then change to schema, whereas Prisma is changing the schema and making them migrations. You can see here where the migrations for Prisma is SQL. Okay. That makes some differences in the way you do migrations. Because, for example, here in Rails, it's completely reversible here because of like how change works. So you can easily run it downwards, i.e., in this case, destroy the table. It's very easy to roll back. Whereas Prisma, it's a bit more of a different story. If the migration completely failed, it's very easy just to mark it as resolved. It's very similar to Rails, and you can just continue with application like booting up. Whereas if you want to go downwards because it's successfully applied, then it's much more complicated compared to Rails. So instead of being able to just run it down and the Prisma working out how to apply downwards, you need to generate the down SQL because the migration was only up. So you have to have a schema file of what the models should look like and what it did and what it looked like on production right now. And then you'll make a difference between the schema files and then you'll make SQL. So it's not super fun doing this when you're on production. Otherwise, you could just do the opposite of what you did here and create a new migration. Okay. The other thing to note about that is because Prisma's migrations are SQL here, this means that you cannot have different providers between the environments. So you can't have PostgreSQL on production and MySQL for development. They're not compatible. Whereas you don't have that problem with Rails because all the migrations are, well, Rails methods, they're agnostic. So that's one interesting thing about Rails. Okay. We can get on to querying now and how it differs. So as I said, with ActiveRecord, you have more of a central place for the model where you can define custom methods, scopes, you name it. Whereas in Prisma, you really don't have that. So with ActiveRecord as well, when you query, it returns a special class, ActiveRecord relation, which allows you to chain all your different scopes that you're used to that are reusable. And you can do like count at the end, for example. Whereas Prisma, it always just returns a simple JavaScript object. It's completely plain. So that means like if you want to relate like cool products on variants, then you need to state that in the query to include it and then call it. Whereas ActiveRecord, you could technically call variants at any time on the product instance. So Prisma is very much, yeah, there's no central place. And then it's also, you always have to change that top level of where you've done the query, whereas Rails, you don't need to do that. Rails is much more focused on passing these model instances around and then chaining up on it. I'll give you a comparison. So this is one query that we have on our Shopify backend right now. And then I made an equivalent in Rails quickly to show you how it can be different. So all of these queries here on the left, you could reuse elsewhere in the application. And then your query inside the service could be very small. Whereas if you see one in Prisma, it's pretty long. It's like 40 lines just to get the orders. So that's one thing I'll say we know. It's not super easy to reuse query snippets in Prisma. But for the small footprint we have for a subscription app, it's not really of a problem. But I could imagine you would have to probably build some better way of doing this if you have a huge application like a Solidus application or similar. Quick mention was one super nice thing about it being a simple object in Prisma is that you get all the types. Okay. Summarizing the last slides, I would say is that ActiveRecord has very sharp tools, which allows you to reuse snippets throughout application for clean code. but because of the abstraction, models can be very coupled across the application because you can just call anything whenever you want it. And also models can be very heavy compared to services. Whereas Prisma tends to have, well, as you don't have a model per se class, your system ends up being very service driven, which can reduce coupling. But as we all know, it's really down to the developer. Like you could have coupling in Prisma, but very little coupling in Rails. Any questions before I continue? Try and go a bit slow. Okay. Leading off that, optimizing in Rails can be quite difficult, I think, because of this. So as I said, you can call relations at any point in time, and that can make it very difficult to debug or try and optimize the query. For example, this is a MeUndies controller where it was getting lots of products and serializing them. But at a first glance, it's quite difficult to say what relations are used for the controller and what should be included for a more optimal query to prevent like n+1s or just too many queries. For example, product gender here seems simple, but actually this goes to a custom method on the model, which calls a relation and maybe even another one. And then we also have product slides here, and then it nests down even further. And so it's quite difficult to know, okay, what relation should I add into includes here for a performant query? I think this is why we get gems like bullet just to solve this problem in Rails. And this can be become even more difficult to optimize when you have even more layers of abstracting. So like serializers in between them, and it's not like a seemingly linear path, or if controllers are used in multiple places. But you don't really have this problem so much in Prisma because everything's a simple object. You know what you get. You have to include it to get the relations. And as everything's typed, it's very easy to type specifically what you want. And then later when you need it, you can easily see that, oh, okay, I need to add it to the select, etc. Okay. Probably won't go over each one of these, but this was just a quick glance I put together of differences between querying on ActiveRecord and Prisma. Hope is correct. Actually, okay. The nested relations, I realize, is you can do this in Rails if you use SQL strings, but not with a nesting. Okay. I want to show an example. It's kind of small. So this is an example of what happens if you can't do something in ActiveRecord. Sorry, Prisma. For example, I want to get all the variants that contains an array of master SKUs. So imagine that this array was bigger, and I want to get all the variants that has a SKU matching this. They're query syntax currently doesn't support this. So what we had to do instead, if you can see, is we had to write it all in pure SQL. Whereas, sorry, okay, you can zoom in. That's cool. So if you use Prisma, you're gonna get good at SQL sometimes. You can see here, we really just wanted this snippet, which they didn't support. So we added this. Whereas in Rails, it's so much simpler. Like you can continue with your regular query, but if something's not out of a box, you can just write SQL snippet. You can mix and match, which is very nice. Okay. The next thing we'll talk about is extensions in Prisma. Because so in Rails, we have a central place for the model. You can add whatever logic you want there, extra fields, or callbacks for validations. As you don't have that in Prisma, they have a concept of extensions, and you create them all in the same way, but there are different types. So one could be adding a new public method on the model. So say you have first name and last name, you can add names which uses both. You can also add methods to Prisma itself. So for example here, that is a client extension, and you could do whatever you want with Prisma. You can also add, this is how you would add middleware. So if you wanted to add soft deletion, etc. We can go over some examples. So for example, this is creating an extension in Prisma. So if, as I said, if we want to have a method where we call name, sorry, maybe I should put this at the top. This is what it would look like in Rails. Pretty simple. But if you want to do it in Prisma, you define an extension, and then you state on what model it should be on for the result, what methods it uses, and then you create the function. And then this is initializing the extension here on the right. So it's a bit verbose, but once you have a setup, then you could add even more methods here, whatever you need. And now, so when I query the customer, I can put in full name here, true, and it will automatically add on the SQL query to include first name and last name, and then compute it and put it back here. So it's a nice way to reduce duplication. One other extension is, this is actually one we have on MeUndies. So we have we added a method to all models, which is upset if new. So they do have an upset method, but what we wanted was one that not only upsets, but upsets if the data is newer than what is currently stored. So we rely on Shopify webhooks for creating and updating all our records on the back end. But Shopify doesn't guarantee that the webhooks come in order. So therefore, to avoid saving with old data, we make sure to only update if that data is new. So works pretty much like a upset until here, and then but then here we have extra logic. So only if data's newer. That's how define it. Mm-hmm. So that's quite one cool thing about if you want to add to all models. Is one last extension, which is if you wanted to add validations in Prisma. So it's not supported in Prisma out of the box compared to Rails. So you have to use third-party packages and then add it as an extension. So this is using Zod, a package, and then we're just creating an extension in the same way. And then so here we're adding it to all the different product methods. So we're just extending the ones that come out of box with Prisma, but we have to do it on every single method, unlike Rails where they have callbacks and you can. It's very easy to add up validations. Okay. Any questions? Okay. We'll go over some limitations of Prisma. See? So one limitation that we had was that, as I said, but so for example, here we query over orders, and we include the line items here. We would love to include the variant relation as well, so we can get extra details about the line item. But that's actually problematic for us because as we create our records based off webhooks, we can't guarantee that the variant for the order line item exists in the database. And so if you go to create this relation right now on production, it fails for us if any of those variants are missing. So we have a need for optional relations, but that's not supported in Prisma. So that's actually been one of the biggest things, like friction points for us with the ORM is that now we have to resort to using SQL to make the joins manually. So you don't realize how good it is just missing. And also, I mean, okay, you could use SQL or you could use Prisma, but then you would have n+1 if you're going to get the variant for each line item. One other limitation is that polymorphic relations are not supported. So you might be familiar with Solidus, for example, on where you have like payment method, and then it's it could be different types of payment methods. So it's using a relation for different type of, using a model for different relations. So for example, we have this selling plan anchor. Actually, we don't use it, but we'd like it on multiple models, so billing policy and delivery policy, but you can't have that just like one relation and then specify what model type it belongs to. So like just have a foreign key and the model type. So instead we had to create a multiple foreign keys, one for each relation. So It's a bit more overhead. And then to allow that, we have to make the foreign keys optional as well. So you lose that benefit of enforcing that this is related to a policy. Makes sense. Like if these foreign keys were missing, we wouldn't know. There's no protection against it, but that would be problematic. Okay. Okay. I'm glad you stayed with me to this part. This is, I think, where it gets more interesting on how the queries work behind the scenes. So here's a comparison of querying a relation between the two ORMs. They are actually, well, first we'll go over ActiveRecord. So here we're querying how many products have a variant above a certain weight. And you can see on the first result, it actually does not return exactly what you'd want in this case. Like if you wanted to know how many products, the first result is actually incorrect, but it's just doing, it's very close to SQL, and SQL would do the same thing. So instead, for the first one, it's returning the number of variants that are joined to a product above a certain weight. Whereas we really want to know how many products are connected to a variant of a certain weight. So we have to remember to add distinct in this case for Rails. Whereas in Prisma, you don't need to worry about the distinct in that case. So it feels a little more intuitive. So here's an example. So I see the database with this data. And then when you go to count a similar query, it returns 3. So if this was in Rails, it would have returned 4 because there are, let's see, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4. There are 4 subscription lines with this variant that we're querying, but there are 3 distinct contracts. I hope that makes sense. So you don't have an exact same problem as Rails, or I feel like you get what you ask for with methods here more precisely, and that's because it works in a different way. So it doesn't do an inner join. So maybe if we look at the other one, this was the Rails one. It's joining all the products with their variants. And then, but with Prisma, maybe it's a little hard to read. It's actually doing a subquery. So in the subquery, it's getting all of the contract IDs from subscription lines where the variant is this one. And then it's counting how many like unique subscription contracts are in that that array. So you don't need a distinct in this case. Does that make sense? I think this will also help explain which is needed for our next scenario. So with these given models, if you do a select like this in SQL, which is similar to the Rails, you'll see, although we're selecting on the users, we're getting each row is the user and their post. So this is what we were seeing in the Rails example, where it was showing the product and then like variant data on each one. Why it counted to 6,000. So this is a problem like ORMs have. Well, it comes from the usage of Rails, SQL, where there's a lot of redundant data. So like we're only interested in user data and then all their posts. But if you look at each of the rows, a lot of the user data is redundant. And it gets even worse the more fields you have, and then also the nesting you do. Like if you included comments here, you would have user duplicated and you'd have post duplicated for every single comment. So we'll see now how ActiveRecord and Prisma gets past this. Another example. So here's demonstrating that problem with Rails. So if you have the products and join them with the variants, it does it in a join and it's done in one query, but you also get redundant data. Really, here, we only have one product here that's boxer brief. But you can see as soon as you join it to with variants, the product size is 4,000. And then on each of yeah. So this is why as well, like in Rails, we have a need for includes. So Rails gets by this problem with using includes because it does two queries and will get exactly the data you want individually. So get all the product data, and then it will get all of the variant data for each of those products. So you'll have no redundant data, but it comes at the cost of doing two queries. Rails will then handle, like if you're calling variants on the product, that serves you up the corresponding variants and such. So there's more heavy lifting done on the application. Prisma's maybe we can go over it at the end. So that's a good point. Prisma's old way of doing this, where you're like, for example, we're getting this description contract and we're including this description lines here. It's very similar to Rails, where it would do one query for the contracts, one query for the lines. So no redundant data, just two queries. However, they managed to solve this problem in with a new way as well, where they managed to do no redundant data and do it all in one query for a more efficient usage. I think this also maybe answers your question a few months ago, Lorenzo, where you talked about this. So let's have a quick look at how they do this. It's quite a big query, but breaking it down, it boils down to because Prisma returns simple objects, they can leverage that. So here we're getting the subscription contract. And then for all the subscription line data, they just make a JSON object and add that on to the subscription contract. So it's baked in the original query. We don't need to do a second one. And we don't need to do a regular join, which would return redundant data. So I think this is pretty cool. Yeah, everything in one query. Some quick overviews of like cool things about each ORM. So I think the main thing for Prisma is that it's very strongly typed. So it's very easy to program with, because you have autocomplete with your code editor. It makes it super beginner friendly. It's very intuitive to use. I think they've done a great way of abstracting SQL. However, that does make it very verbose. The next thing is Prisma Studio, which I'll show in a few slides. Well, actually, I can do it now. It makes more sense. So they also have a, you can run a command and you can see all the model database in a UI on your browser, which I think is super cool. It makes it quite nice for development if you want to change some of the data or add relations even, or create records, delete records, etc. So useful. It's not that great for production though. I mean, if you have millions of files, I don't know, I'd rather use a console. But cool for development. Yeah. Overview of Rails is that it's very strongly flexible. You can save snippets, reuse them through the application, have your queries clean, mix and matching SQL with DSL is super nice. Calling relations at any point in time and going between things is very nice. But that does become your Achilles heel with performance. So something you need to be aware of. There's a lot of things out of the box, like validations, just adding any other middleware you want. They have inbuilt caching. One thing as well I forgot to mention was with their migrations, as it's not SQL, you can make it whatever you want. So they natively support data migrations, whereas Prisma does not. You have to create a script for data migrations. That's about it.